Greetings again, students. This is the video lecture for week 3. The readings this week are on Insurgency, Civil War, and Terrorism. And in the last couple of weeks, this week, much like the last couple of weeks, is kind of a toolkit, right, in terms of thinking about these concepts. So in the first week, we talked about transnationalism and globalization, and those processes and how they're working together. Last week, we talked about social movement theory, ideological framing, resource mobilization, political opportunity structures, success, how do we define outcomes, that kind of thing. And this week we talk about what is civil war, what is insurgency, what is terrorism, how do these processes of political violence take place, and since this is a main focus of the course, transnational dimensions of political violence, then we want to be clear about what kind of political violence we're talking about. And so to that end, the readings kind of fit into two categories broadly, right? One is insurgency and civil war, and the other is on terrorism. And so I give you the Coercive piece first, the logic of violence and civil war, because I think it does a really good job of laying out some definitions of civil war, which he specifically refers to as armed combat within the boundaries of a recognized sovereign entity between parties subject to a common authority at the outset of hostilities, page 17. So this is a really good conceptual definition of civil war. So if you're talking about a conflict in your paper, this is a good one to use. Or if you're looking to study these things moving down the road, this is one of the definitions you can look at. So that's a conceptual definition. Practically speaking, a lot of times people define civil war specifically as having 1,000 or more battle deaths, 100 of which are battle deaths are caused by both sides. So both sides are involved in the killing. If it's just one side, then it's a genocide or an extermination or something like that, heavy repression. But if both sides are involved, then we have an actual civil war. There are also what they call civil conflicts, which are 25 battle deaths or more, which are much more low level. So that's the distinction. And it's important when people are doing analyses and you're reading these analyses of civil war, which one are they talking about? And how are they defining the concept? And how are they operationalizing the concept? So it gets us to think a lot about that. The Coercive piece also does a really good job talking about violence and the different uses and aims of violence, and defines violence as the deliberate infliction of harm on people. So that's really broad. There's a lot of violence that takes place in a lot of different ways. But when we want to narrow it down and talk about political violence specifically, he gets into kind of the aims of violence and how it can be used, and part of that plays into why it's political. But he talks about expressive violence, which serves no instrumental purpose, violence for violence's sake, or violence for the individual to kind of express themselves, or it could be. This is mostly on an individual level, so it could be somebody who lost their family to government repression, and they're using violence to get back as a revenge thing. It's not trying to coerce necessarily. It's doing something for the individual that's committing the violence. But the other type that he talks about is coercive violence, right, which is used to exterminate a group or to control it. So, and it fails if it merely destroys the subject whose compliance is sought, he says, right? So if you kill the person that you're trying to get to comply, it's not coercive violence. Then it becomes like genocide again, or extermination. So anyway, most political violence falls into this coercive category, because you're trying to get, whether it's terrorism or whether it's civil war, or insurgency, I should say, is you're trying to get the other side to do something, whether it's to get the government to step down or to change a policy or to leave a country or whatever it may be. You're attempting to coerce them to do something through the use of violence. I think there's a third kind of violence that doesn't get discussed here, and that's symbolic violence. Symbolic violence could be something that's meant to rally people to your cause. It's the use of violence to kind of show how serious you are and to show the world what you're willing to do. And violence is very symbolic, right? And especially stuff where you desecrate bodies or mutilate bodies or do that kind of thing. That kind of violence is very symbolic, and it can get people, as oddly as it sounds, it can get people to rally around your cause. So when you think about ISIS or Islamic State and their use of beheadings in their propaganda videos, I think this is a form of symbolic violence. They're not trying to. Some of it's coercive, and these categories overlap. So you could be using expressive violence to get back at somebody for something that's been done to you, while at the same time trying to send a signal to coerce somebody, while at the same time trying to create a symbol by which other people will do what you're doing. So anyway, Islamic State uses violence in their videos, and that's not only to coerce governments and say, hey, we're real, we're here to do bad things, but it's also to get other people that might look at that and say, oh, this is really interesting. I really like how these people are using this violence. I want to be a part of this. That's why it's part of their recruitment video, right? So that's a form of violence that Calivas doesn't really talk about, or an aim of violence that he doesn't talk about that I think is important. He also gives this typology of mass political violence on page 29. I won't go into detail on that, but it's another way of conceptually thinking about political violence and putting it in categories so we know when we're talking about certain kinds of violence and not others. And this happens a lot in political studies of political violence in general. We want to be real clear about concepts and conceptual definitions, and what do we put in this bin that we call terrorism? What do we call in this bin that we call insurgency? And this brings up a good point that I kind of wanted to talk about in relation to the readings is, terrorist is a little bit of a misnomer, right? Because a terrorist is actually an extremist or somebody who holds extreme views that's using terrorism as a strategy. Insurgents, also a misnomer. These are extremists or citizens or criminals in some cases that are using insurgency as a strategy. And that the outcome of a terrorist event or the outcome of the use of terrorism is a terrorist event or terror event, and the outcome of the use of insurgency is a civil war, in theory, or a civil conflict if it's more low level. So anyway, just splitting these things up, so we're talking about actors who are using strategies that are causing events that are leading to outcomes, right? There's a process, and so if we call somebody a terrorist, what is that? An extremist can use terrorism as a strategy, and they can also use insurgency as a strategy. Those aren't mutually exclusive. If you look at the Islamic State and think about it, they started off using terrorism as a strategy. Now they're using insurgency in Syria as a strategy. They're holding territory, attempting to govern. They're contesting power with Assad and the ruling regime. But then outside of Syria, and even in Syria, against the Assad regime, they're using terrorism as a strategy. So those two things are two different strategies being used by the same actor. And so is the Islamic State terrorists? Again, they're extremists that are using, some of them are using terrorism, some of them are using insurgency. But it helps us to think about these things and keep them conceptually separate and put them in the right pins. So anyway, I think that Calivas' piece does a really good job of getting us to think about these things and how important they are. There's a couple other pieces that are more targeted, the Salehian reading and the Glittish reading, both about kind of transnational dimensions of civil war in one, and then transnational rebels and neighboring states in the other. So these are just ways to think about how the transnational linkages are affecting civil war. Again, for 30 years ago, interstate conflict, interstate war was what it was all about, the study of how two states go to war with one another. And then about 20 or 30 years ago, we had the development of kind of, what about these interstate conflicts? There are more civil wars nowadays than there are conditional or traditional wars. So what's going on with that? But when people did that, they started looking at the characters of the states that the war was occurring in. GDP, population, access to resources, that kind of thing. But it turns out that a lot of these things aren't just inherent to the state. There are things that are going on transnationally that are affecting this conflict in the first place. They might affect its onset, they might affect its duration, or its lethality, or when it ends, or its outcome. Lots of things are going on, but it's not just restricted to what's going on in that state. So the Salehian piece talks about the kind of state's limited ability based on its sovereign territory, that they have a lot of control over their sovereign territory, but once they move out of that, it's very hard to use violence, right? The monopoly of violence is what allows a state to exist. That's kind of a justification for it, is we get to say when violence is used and when it's not. So if you cross a state border, you're now moving over to a place where somebody else theoretically gets to say when violence is okay and when it's not. And so he talks about these transnational rebels, and especially neighboring states as sanctuaries for rebel groups, right, where they can attack the state that they're trying to coerce and then retreat across the border, and then that first state doesn't have the ability to move across. Sometimes they do, but it becomes a lot harder. There's a lot stickier to violate that sovereignty, and so transnational rebels are using this to their advantage. And Salehian finds that it extends conflicts, has these large effects in terms of processes of civil war. And then the Glittage piece is very similar and kind of wants to look at, okay, well, what are these other dimensions, right? So that lead to onset and duration, that kind of thing. So he looks at ethnic groups, right? You can have an ethnic group that's, they're not contained just in one state. They're across borders and that kind of thing. So if you think about the Kurds that are in the Middle East, right? The Kurds, some are in Turkey and Jordan and Syria. Their region where they're located is kind of at the intersection of like 4 or 5 other countries. And so they're almost by definition a transnational group. And they use violence in Turkey and in other places. They use nonviolence in some places. And they use political methods in other ways, where they try and seek autonomy and get their own elections and have a voice in the national political discussion. And so there's a lot of strategies that these transnational actors can use, but fundamentally they're spread across these large areas. So Glittage talks about that okay, well, if you have related ethnic groups that are right next to each other in the same country and across the border, then those people across the border might be willing to lend a hand and do more for their ethnic kin that are in that state. So that can lead to more conflict, or it can lead to longer conflict. He also looks at political linkages, right? And so places that have less democratic institutions that are close to each other tend to have more war. And then trade integration, that these economic linkages, because if I have economic interest, if we share a natural resource pool with the country next to us, I might be really interested in what happens in that country's civil war. So I might support one group who's going to represent my interests in that when that conflict is resolved. So you have a lot of these transnational linkages that are going on, both in terms of the use of territory and in terms of kind of the solidarity or the political connections, economic or ethnic connections. All of these things can help change the dynamics of a civil war in important ways. And this is just scratching the surface. There's a bunch of work that's being done on this and has been done. And even this was 10 years ago. So they're looking at kind of limited linkages and limited things. And again, the Syria conflict is a perfect example of there's a tremendous amount of transnational connections that are taking place in that country, as well as international. And so they don't always mesh very well, and that's part of the reason it's seen as a very intractable conflict right now. So moving on to our discussion of terrorism, right, as opposed to the Civil War and insurgency part. I had you read the Hoffman piece, The Inside Terrorism, and I like this piece for a lot of reasons. First, it gives a nice history of the word terrorism. It provides a good definition, a nice clear one on page 43 and 44. It even discusses kind of differences in definitions between the State Departments and the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, and talks about why defining terrorism has been a really hard thing historically. And I think that's really important, that's really interesting. But what I also find really interesting, especially for us, is kind of the history of terrorism and how that strategy has been transmitted and used over and over again by people in different places that have very little connections to one another. So it starts off, he talks about Carlo Piscine and his propaganda by deed concept that led to the Anarchist International, which is a loose transnational network of people that are responsible for a lot of political assassinations, including a U.S. president, around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. But, Carlo Piscine was saying that violence is necessary to draw attention to or generate publicity for a cause, but also to inform, educate, and ultimately rally the masses behind revolution. So it has this very instrumental quality. His quote, people will not be free when they are educated, but educated when they are free. That violence is used to kind of start a spark, to start a process that then can lead to this big change. And, a lot of people say, oh, education is needed first before you can get that change. And Carlo Piscine was saying, no, you need to have change start happening, and that's going to educate people as to what's real, what needs to be done, and then they'll get up and do something about it. And this idea was taken by the Narodnya Volya Volya in Russia, the People's Will, as they call it. And that was very much what they were trying to do. Their violence was instrumental, and it was targeted against elites specifically. It wasn't wanton against civilians like we see today in some ways. But it was still this idea that we need to use violence against these elites to get the masses, to get the people, the peasants or whatever, motivated and to get things started. And then the Narodnya Volya leaves a big legacy for people to come after, right? The People's Will. Then you get into the Anarchist International, takes some of those concepts, and then later the Narodnya Obrana, the People's Defense, which had this splinter group called the Black Hand, who a very clandestine organization, used a lot of political violence, and they're tied to, you know, the people that assassinated Franz Ferdinand and started World War I. So we have these kind of linkages where you get from, you know, somebody in Italy saying something that gets transferred to Russia and gets used as a concept that gets retransmitted to Eastern Europe, and then if it, you know, inspires somebody to take out a U.S. president, and then later to take out somebody else, and starts a world war because of it, right? So even 100 years ago, you had these transnational processes that were taking place. And the Anarchist International is a real good example of kind of a transnational social movement, just like Communist International, a transnational social movement that's using all the stuff we talk about, organization, resources, framing, political opportunities, all of these things to their advantage to spread their message and affect the change that they're seeking. So that's one of the reasons I have you read it, is to think about how these things build on each other from generation to generation and era to era, and how this is what we're seeing today is not in a vacuum. That a lot of the stuff is built on what people have learned. You know, we talked about last week. We talked about repertoires of contention. You know, these tactics that become popular and then transmitted, and other people use those tactics. The reason that we have what we have today is because people in the past have used certain things. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, and that's why, you know, people are using some of these same things that we saw 100 years ago in a slightly different form. So anyway, there were a couple other pieces. The CFR video that's on transnational terrorism just gets you to think about how transnational terrorism and foreign fighters kind of intersect, and the kind of intersection there. But then the piece on the EIR article on transnational terrorism was really good. It was written just like a couple of months ago, so it's really recent. It kind of talks about what the state of the debate and the state of knowledge about terrorism is, very briefly. And so it's a really good piece. And it talks a little bit about how we're trying to think about, you know, the profile for somebody who will engage in terrorism, and how that's kind of a myth. You know, we have these profiles and we say, oh, these kind of characteristics are going to be emblematic of people that choose to use terrorism. But a lot of people that have those characteristics, most people, the vast majority of people don't wind up using terrorism. And on the flip side, these people that we wouldn't normally profile, some of them wind up using terrorism. So this profile idea hasn't been as helpful as some people want it to be. So you get to more of this pathway argument, where how does an individual go from being an extremist through this radicalization process to then want to use political violence? And that there are stops along the way where they make decisions, where they go left or they go right. And so the whole point of kind of CVE and countering violent extremism is to kind of find ways to make them go left instead of right on that process, right? And so, you know, there's some questions about CVE, and people are studying it right now, and yada yada. And so whether or not that's the most effective form, that's what's the most popular right now to think about. And I think it's a fairly good one. If you think about community policing, is a similar concept when you talk about criminology, and you know, if you want to figure out why people commit crime, if you want to prevent crime, you got to dig into the communities in which this stuff is occurring and understand those communities and address their concerns and have a dialogue with them, so that you're creating this kind of mutual respect that's going to reduce crime, in theory. And in some ways, community policing has really helped out a lot of police departments. So in other places, it hasn't been as effective. So same thing with CVE, my guess is. We're going to see some places where it's going to show us that this is a really effective way of doing it, and then other places where it's not. And so our goal as scholars, and our challenge, is to find those factors that are similar in certain situations and those factors that are different, and how we can counteract these violent acts. So I think that kind of sums it up for the readings individually. I would just say a couple of things kind of as broader comments on the readings. And the first one is that most of the readings provide really good definitions and really good concepts. And sometimes these definitions and concepts don't always line up with one another, and that's okay. But it helps give you some ammunition for your papers, and also for when we're starting to look at things in the next set of readings and down the road, gives you more ammunition to analyze things adequately and appropriately moving forward. So, you know, there's a lot of discussions of that, and, you know, they quote other people, they cite other people, and if you find a line or a sentence that seems really interesting, you want to dig into it, there's probably a citation that goes with it. go look up that article and read the abstract or read the intro and see if it's something that's interesting to you. You know, following that things down the rabbit hole kind of from one place to the next is going to lead you to a lot of interesting stuff, and it's going to get you the citations that you need for your paper and that kind of stuff. So as much as this class is about me introducing you to a lot of the stuff and clarifying as much of it as I can, it's also about you following your instinct and following your curiosity and finding out more about the topics that are going to be most useful to you in your academic career and your professional career, and even in the short term help you to do your paper and write a really good paper. So just like last week, there were lots of good definitions and concepts, and the week before, definitions and concepts. These first 3 weeks are all about, okay, here's the transnational toolkit, here's the social movement theory toolkit, here's this political violence toolkit, and now the next 3 or 4 weeks we kind of get into more of the practical application of these things. But again, this week is full of a lot of good stuff that you can use moving forward, so think about that stuff. These discussions of how the process of political violence works, I think, is important too, to think about these things as a process, not as just an outcome, but violence doesn't just happen one day. It doesn't pop out of nowhere. There are a lot of things that are going on, and this is where social movement theory can really help out, because you have to have a grievance that then you can mobilize around, that you can frame a certain way, that then you can take advantage of opportunity structures, and then get to the point where, okay, you can use this violence, and it's a process by which it's taking place. And it's a back and forth between the potential resistors and the government. They're anticipating what the government's going to do, and the government's trying to anticipate what they're going to do. And those choices lead us down certain paths, right? So, again, in studies of civil war, repression is always a huge factor. If there's a widespread repression, you're more likely to see violence. And that's instrumental, it's expressive, but, it's kind of that fight fire with fire mentality, that if violence starts getting used against you on a regular basis, you're more likely to turn to violence as a strategy moving forward. So a couple of the last points I think are really interesting. There's kind of this discussion of the role of states and the diminishing role of states, that kind of as globalization, as these processes increase, that we have these the increase in the importance of transnational actors and transnational networks and groups and movements and all that stuff. And as that increases, the kind of power of the state and the centrality of the state is diminishing. And again, we don't necessarily have to agree with that, but that's kind of a theme that keeps coming up, is that states have very delimited abilities and powers, and once you start getting these transnational movements, they are not limited in the same way that the states are. So the states are having a hard time adjusting to a lot of this. And if you think about transnational terror networks and how Al-Qaeda is still around despite 16 years of hunting them down to the ends of the earth, as George Bush would say, they're still around, and they've lost ground, and they've lost resources, they've lost a lot of other things, but in some ways they're still going strong. AQAP, AQIM, there's a number of different places where they're still doing what they set out to do. This might be a lull period for them, but as long as they're still around, there's a chance that they could cycle back. And that resilience is a pretty important factor when we're thinking about these things moving forward. And they, in some ways, have this potential to outlast states. Potential, like I said, but that's something that states need to at least think about and consider moving forward, I would say. And I think some of the authors would say that as well, is that states need to start thinking a little bit more outside the box if they're going to deal with these problems that are much larger in scope than anybody thought they could be. So I also thought it was important to point out that even in these readings, Taro gets quoted, Tilly gets quoted, Zald gets quoted a little bit, McCarthy and Zald do. So the social movement theory is still peppered throughout some of these discussions, and I hope you guys picked up on some of that as well. And so it's important to think that these things are not totally exclusive. It's just that in a lot of ways, a lot of the analytical power of social movement theory has not been brought to bear on political violence yet, and especially transnational political violence. And so our task is to think about how we can improve that, and think about how we can apply ideas about transnationalism in an economic or a commercial sense or a business sense, and how we can think about social movement theory in a nonviolent context, and how we can think about those things more in a political violence setting, and how much of it transfers, how much of it is useful, and how much of it isn't. So, and again, the kind of instrumental use of violence sets all this apart from those other things that we're talking about. So at the same time, it's important that we understand why this violence is unique and why the use of this violence is unique. And then we kind of blend these things together and use what we can and figure out where it works and figure out where it doesn't. And so that's the challenge moving forward, like I said, is to apply these kind of tools that we've learned over the last couple of weeks to the readings moving forward in your discussion board, your reaction papers, and especially to your paper, and thinking about how you can get these different concepts to move together. And I'm happy to answer questions if you have them about some of that stuff. But I think it's an interesting exercise, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. And then also to think about how, if you're going to do something like this down the road, how does this affect your thinking about what you want to get into, and how can you bring this knowledge to bear in a way that could be potentially really helpful to policymakers and academics or students or other venues where you want to showcase this knowledge in the future. You know, what can you bring to the table that's different? And this is one of the ways that you can do it. So, like I said, the challenge is now to apply this stuff moving forward and start thinking about those papers and those research questions. That's due this week, you know. So, you know, think about what is it about this movement that I want to try to explain that not everybody, you know, not a lot of other people have explained really well, or somebody did, but I don't quite think it's the right answer. You know, look for those holes, look for those little things where you're like, well, yeah, but what about this other element that you're kind of ignoring? And it's going to take you thinking about this thing over here that was not written for what you're thinking about, and taking it up, you're thinking up a level and thinking across these readings and getting them to kind of interact with one another. And I think that's a challenge, but at the same time, I think it's going to be highly rewarding, and you're going to have some good papers to show for it. So, anyway, without further ado, thank you guys for watching. I hope everything turns out well this week with the discussion board posts, and next week we have a lot of readings with the foreign fighters. I'm going to make a couple of them optional, and I'll send out an email about, you know, you can skim this paper, but make sure you get on the readings early, and I look forward to reading your reaction papers for that set of readings, as well as the discussion board stuff on this lecture and the readings we just had. So hope everyone is well, and we'll see you next week, okay? All right, bye.